Thank you. I would also like to use this opportunity to show our support and solidarity to the thousands of peaceful protesters at rallies across North America and the world, including here in Nova Scotia, some of which are taking place as we speak. You have been called many names, but you're also human rights activists. These protests, led by primarily young people, are expression of years of pent-up frustrations with racism and inequality, unchecked violence perpetrated against Black communities and communities of color. Dalhousie condemns these racist acts, and we recognize that currently we are battling two pandemics: a pandemic of decades of racial injustice and legal lynching, and the COVID-19 pandemic that has revealed existing racial disparities in medical services and economic opportunities for Black communities, impoverished communities, Indigenous communities, and all marginalized communities of color. We believe that all citizens should have the basic right to live safe and healthy lives, regardless of the color of their skin or identity. The Lord Dalhousie report reminds us that institutions of higher education have been part of the problem and that there are racial disparities on our campus. But we also believe that we can be part of the solution. Do we need to do more? Yes. Can we do more? Yes. Do we need to accelerate what we are doing? Yes. Are we moving towards that goal? Yes. One of the many ways in which we can do this is by marshaling the expertise of our faculty and the energy of our students and developing meaningful approaches and engaging in analysis and understanding critical to the mitigation of racism and inequalities on and off our campus. We understand that to do this is imperative that we partner with our marginalized communities in healthy and honest debate, discourse, and action aimed at changing systemic racism, social disparities, and racial violence. It is within this understanding that our forum tonight features our own Dalhousie expertise, but also provides a seat at our table for community representation and a space for our Black neighbors in the US, as racism has no border or walls. So I'd like to profusely thank our panelists for sharing their Friday afternoon with us and engaging in what I call transformative conversation. I would also like to thank you, the audience, for tuning in. And we usually leave it at the end, but I would like to do it in the beginning to thank the staff behind the scene who have made this virtual reality a reality. So thank you, Amina, April, and Mihal. Before I introduce the speakers and their bios, there are a few housekeeping things that we must talk about. One of it is that when we invite our speaker, you will see them on the screen and hear them. Everybody else's cameras and microphones are turned off to ensure that only the panelists are speaking. Unfortunately, we do not have a chat feature in this event, but you can post your questions in the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen, and we will address these at the end of the session. The event is being recorded as an educational tool for future reference, and we'll let you know when it's posted. And last but not least, this is a virtual event. So please, if there's any technical difficulties, please bear with us. I was reminding my little crew there that I could also come off screen in case a hurricane or something hits us, but hopefully that will not happen. So without further ado, I'll read the bios of the panelists in the order which they are presenting and then hand it over to them. So our first speaker will be Dr. Derek Brooms. Dr. Derek Brooms is a faculty in sociology and Africana study at the University of Cincinnati and serves as a youth worker as well. His research and activism focus on educational equity, race and racism, and diversity and equity. Primarily, his research centers on the lives and experiences of Black boys and men and representations in the media. He is the author of Being Black, Being Male on Campus, Understanding and Confronting Black Male Collegiate Experiences, and is currently working on a project that examines how Black men make sense of racial profiling and killing of Black boys and men. Dr. Brooms, welcome to Canada and to Nova Scotia. The second speaker will be Dr. Rhonda Britton. Dr. Rhonda Britton is the senior pastor of New Horizons Baptist Church, formerly Cornwallis Street in Halifax, Nova Scotia. She was born and raised in Jacksonville, Florida. Completing college in New York, she lived and worked for 20 years in New York and New Jersey before coming to Nova Scotia. We are happy that you made that choice. Dr. Britton has earned several degrees, including a Master of Divinity degree from Princeton Theology Seminary, Princeton, New Jersey, and a Doctor of Ministry degree from Acadia University, Wolfville, Nova Scotia. Pastor Rhonda practices a living faith by being active in the community. She currently serves as the moderator of the African United Baptist Association of Nova Scotia, as chair of the Richard Preston Center for Excellence, vice president of the Canadian Baptist of Atlantic Canada. She's on the Correction Canada's Interfaith Committee on Chaplaincy and on the anti-violence initiatives in the Halifax municipality, and various other boards and advisory councils. With such a packed bio, Dr. Britton, we are so happy that you made the time for us this evening. The third presenter is our own Tiffany Gordon, PhD student in philosophy. We are so proud of her. Her areas of research include social and political thought, feminist philosophy, and philosophy of race. In her dissertation, she will be examining the over-incarceration of Black and Indigenous people in Canada through the lens of collective historical responsibility for race-based oppression. Dr. Omishori Dryden. She does not require any introduction because I think by now everybody knows Dr. Dryden, but I will still read her impressive bio. She is the James R. Johnson Chair in Black Canadian Studies in the Faculty of Medicine and an associate professor in the Department of Community Health and Epidemiology. Dr. Dryden is an interdisciplinary scholar whose scholarship and research is situated in Black Canadian thought, specifically Black queer diasporic analytics. She is a researcher in resident and a member of the African, Caribbean, and Black Program Science Scholars Lab at the Ontario HIV Treatment Network. She's also a member of the Black Feminist Health Science Studies International Research Group. Dr. Dryden is the co-editor of Disrupting Queer Inclusion, Canadian Homo-Nationalism and the Politics of Belonging, and has published numerous other journal articles. Lastly, we will have Dr. Isaac Zany, who is the director for Dalhousie's groundbreaking transition year program, established in 1970, so we just celebrated its 50th anniversary. The TYP was established to redress educational barriers and injustice facing the Mi'kmaq Nation, other First Nations, and African Nova Scotian. His teaching and scholarship encompasses Cuba, Africa, and the Caribbean, the US Civil Rights Movement, and Black Nova Scotia history. He recently taught the course History of Race and Racism in the US. Dr. Zany, you and Dr. Brooms could have a conversation on that course. And he is in the process of completing the book, Africa's Children Return, Cuba, Africa, and the End of Apartheid. He's a community activist and a participant in the anti-war movement and the anti-racist struggle, whose roots lie in Black Nova Scotia community and the Caribbean. Just before we started, I told people that whenever I met Dr. Zany in the community, everyone around him knows him, so I have dubbed him the Shadow Mayor of Nova Scotia. So welcome to my esteemed panelists. Dr. Brooms, I will let you lead off the conversation to give us your 10 minutes presentation on a topic of your choice. Welcome.
Thank you for having me, and thank you to my colleagues, my distinguished colleagues who I'm sharing this panel with. I come with a heavy heart, and I'm a bit still in pain from the violence that continues to be perpetuated on Black bodies and Black lives. And so as I think about Mr. George Floyd and so many others who you mentioned, Dr. Rajak Talley, I'm also thinking about Brianna Taylor, especially given that today is her born day. I'm also thinking about Tony McDade, a transgender man, Black man who was killed a few days ago. And so as I think about what it is that we're called here today to discuss and talk about, it's just heavy. It's a heaviness that is very difficult to articulate sometimes. And even with that difficulty in trying to articulate it, it is a reality that we must endure. And so even as I think about those folks who have been killed from anti-Black violence, I also think about those of us who are still scarred and marred by anti-Black violence so that it is not fatal. So as examples, I think about Ms. Darnella Frazier, who filmed George Floyd's death. I think about Rachel Jontel, who filmed Trayvon Martin's death. Or I even can think about folks like Christian Cooper and all of the complexities of experiences where, although police did not have to intervene in that particular case, the threat of violence, and in particular state violence, was called upon to assuage white fear and to try to placate and play to the notions of Black male as criminal. And so one of the things that I think is very important is to speak to the specificity of anti-Black racism and to really kind of move the conversation beyond just kind of these general notions of racism. So as I think about anti-Blackness and kind of what's at the root of this, part of what I'm thinking about is the ways in which it renders our humanity as unimaginable, invisible, and absent. And so as I think about anti-Blackness, it's used to really describe the lack of awareness and acknowledgement of Black humanity that is also kind of prescribed by this very specific violence that is perpetuated against Black life, Black bodies, as well as Black communities. And so the important thing to really consider is that anti-Blackness is not individualized. And that's one of the things that I hope we kind of understand and make clear, is that what we see happen to George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, is not an individual act of violence, it's an act of violence perpetuated against Black folks in general. It is an act of violence perpetuated against Black lives in general. And so we can talk about various tactics that are used, as I've kind of talked about in the past with regards to, as examples, the chokehold that killed Eric Garner, the knee on the neck that killed George Floyd, the no-knock illegal warrant that was used in the killing, the entry and killing of Breonna Taylor. We can talk about kind of all of those things, but the reality is that anti-Black violence, anti-Black racism is unrelenting. And so it makes me think of a number of things that I really want to kind of center and highlight in the brief time that I have here. And so in one sense, I'm thinking about kind of, what does it mean when we think about anti-Black racism, anti-Black violence? And the first thing that I'm thinking about is Derek Bell's notion of faces at the bottom of the well. And so I think about this kind of contention and this conceptualization that Derek Bell, the late legal scholar at Harvard, who worked at Harvard University for a number of years. And one of the things that he talked about was this permanence of racism, especially within the US context, where racism is a reality. It manipulates and renegotiates itself across various eras and generations. But racism and violence, if we think about these kind of two, has been a constant, or not has, but both have been constants in this American project. And so as I think about the violence perpetuated against Black life, Black people, Black folks not only within the US, but globally. I mean, this is regardless of our attained or achieved statuses. This is irregardless of kind of where we are. So notions of wrong place, wrong time, notions of you fit the description, notions of, you know, mind your own business, etc. You know, all of these things that we think about, the ways in which our lives and our neighborhoods and communities are both policed and hyper-policed, it is all kind of perpetuated through violence and violating not just our citizenship rights, but violating our human rights. And so what does anti-Black racism kind of mean then? And I just kind of have a few things. Number one, and not in particular order, but first, what I'm thinking is that it demands that we constantly navigate our society with a burden of proof, right? So Black folks are burdened with this notion that we have to always already prove that we belong, regardless of our positions. For instance, a professor at Virginia Commonwealth University called campus security on another professor simply because that professor, this Black professor, was eating lunch in the classroom. So clearly you don't belong because I could not imagine you as a professor. So even when we have some of the highest degrees that we can attain as it relates to educational credentials, these are still not and never enough. I'm thinking about some colleagues, Jenkins Cole, and in particular my colleague Antar Chavakunda, as they talk about the notion of the second ID, right? The idea that Blacks have to need to have and often need to show some type of additional identification beyond a driver's license or a passport, primarily one that connects us to some form of a higher education institution, you know, maybe even better if it's an elite one, to prove some semblance of our worth, to prove that we are quote unquote okay. So this in some ways plays to respectability. I can't respect you and acknowledge you unless you have this second form of identification. Anti-Black racism also means that there is a particular form and practice of racism that is specific to Black peoples and communities. And so what we know from reams of evidence in every form that we can find it is that the punishments are more severe and the costs are more burdensome that we continue to shoulder. So I could think about this from the aspects of Dr. James Cameron to Emmett Till to Khalif Browder. I could think about this from Adam A. Collins, Cynthia Wesley, Carol Robinson, and Carol Denise McNair. I could think about this as it relates to Assadam Shakur and Mumia Abu-Jamal, from Walter McMillan to Troy Davis, from Sandra Bland to Renisha McBride to Brianna Taylor, to Tanya McDowell, who tried to enroll her son in the school, and because she was not in the right area code, she's serving 5 years in prison. So I can think about being brutalized to set an example to other Black folks about quote unquote staying in our place. So this enduring violence and this enduring and continuous violence before, during, and after, because you want to exercise your constitutional and citizenship rights. So I'm thinking about the ways in which New York State has, you know, in some ways decided to suspend habeas corpus for folks who are out kind of protesting the anti-Black violence that has been perpetuated by police. And at the same time, we don't see these type of actions when white folks who belong to various groups, some in the alt-right and others, storm to state capitol buildings demanding that we reopen the economy. Anti-Black racism means that as Blacks attempt to navigate, you know, a variety of social institutions, we're constantly repositioned as both perpetual and unwanted guests. Unless, of course, you can, as mentioned, provide some form of capital for others. And so this capital can be gained primarily through our labor. And so what I'm thinking about in particular, especially as it relates to higher education institutions, is what some of my colleagues, T. Elon Dancy and others talk about as plantation politics. So this is generational trauma. This is institutional neglect, right? And so what I'm most kind of captured by and what's kind of held me almost still over the past week and a half and 2 weeks is our continuous pleas and cries that continue to fall on deaf ears, the ways in which the silence of folks kind of reconstitutes, reimagines, perpetuates continuously the violence that we experience. And so what I'm thinking about is from George Floyd to Eric Garner to Sandra Bland, the list is way too long to even try to name. So this is all the way back to before the Mayflower, 1619, is the notion that we can't breathe. We can't breathe because we're being brutalized for demanding that our human rights remain intact. We can't breathe because we're SOBs and we're thugs and we're too often in the wrong place at the wrong time. We can't breathe because anti-Black racism demands our complicity in our own demise. We can't breathe because what does it mean for people feeling a need and a call to take to the streets and speak out against anti-Black violence and racism during a pandemic? We can't breathe because it means we live in neighborhoods and communities that are starved, continuously reeling from divestment and retail redlining. We can't breathe because we attend too many schools where windows don't open, where air conditioning doesn't work, where we don't have enough books, where we have more police officers than counselors. It means that we attend colleges and universities that are rife with racial hostilities and indifference. It means enduring macroaggressions and explicit biases. It means that people try to take or, credit for your intellectual property at the same time they hold lower and no expectations for our intellectual genius. It means that our development is constantly arrested and our futures are constantly denied. It means that we're driving while Black, praying while Black, walking and running while Black, because we fit descriptions that we were already made to subscribe to. Because of Tulsa, Oklahoma, which will be 100 years in the burning of Black Wall Street next year. Because of the Mississippi Delta, because everything south of Canada is the South. Because the words we speak that may be pretty sounding, especially in diversity statements and all of these ways in which our higher education institutions want to make statements about how they stand with Black folks in these times of need. And at the same time, what we don't see enough of is your retention and recruitment strategies for Black faculty, the ways in which you recruit and retain Black students, the tenure statuses and successful tenure promotion of Black faculty, the too little Black leadership that is offered and provided at these institutions, and of course the curriculums that never find it appropriate to include us beyond one unit, 1 week, et cetera, et cetera. So as I think about anti-Black racism and anti-Black violence, I see it perpetuated against us in every facet of our lives, and primarily as instituted and held across every social institution in our society. And again, specifically thinking about this through the US context. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Brooms. I'm sure there'll be lots of room for conversations and even amongst ourselves. So again, I want to thank you for being here with us. I would like to have adopted this concept since I'm in Halifax of the talking stick. So I would like to now pass the talking stick on to Dr. Rhonda Britton. Dr. Reverend Britton, please go ahead and do your 10 minutes presentation.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you to the organizers for the opportunity to participate on this distinguished panel. I appreciate being here during this difficult time in our history. I'm speaking this evening not only from the perspective of a Black woman, but as a clergy person. Let us be clear. The church's response to issues of racism in the world has been shamefully derelict. This has been the case since explorers left Europe with a misplaced sense of entitlement that included the claiming of lands they stumbled upon, disregarding the inhabitants of the land. That disregard was often a violent conquering taking life indiscriminately for the sake of whatever monarch they represented. In the European culture of exploration and exploitation, conquering and colonization, whatever objection the church has made was easily ignored. We know there was an abolitionist movement during the centuries of the kidnapping and enslavement of African peoples. Some of the opposition came from religious leaders, but even papal bulls issued by the Catholic Church did not stop the actions of individuals who chose to participate in the African slave trade. As for the Protestant Church, with no authority like a pope or to issue edicts or bulls, most Protestants in the South saw slave labor as a means to economic prosperity. They misinterpreted, co-opted, and misused scripture to justify slavery. They told themselves that African people and natives of any land they conquered were inferior and needed protection for their own good. Because, of course, any culture different from their own was ignorant, uncivilized, and savage. And so we see in these messages the seed of insidious evil that continues to this day, even in the church. There are many persons who self-identify as Christian that still harbor these beliefs. Some of it is conscious. A lot of it is subconscious, that somehow Black and brown-skinned people are inferior. It has been passed on from generation to generation in the ways of being around others, in comments that are made about others, in attitudes and beliefs borne out through action or inaction. In media images and stories, information is flowing. Stereotypes and preconceptions abound. Our children are always watching and learning from us. The perpetuation of these stereotypes, these images, these beliefs after centuries have persisted because of the images that people want to play up, especially in media. And we see it played out in instances of a young white male praying and having Bible study in a Black church and then killing 9 Black people. And after being apprehended, is treated to Burger King. When George Floyd, who they suspected of somehow passing a counterfeit $20 bill, ends up face down on the pavement with a knee in his neck, saying, "I can't breathe." These messages are layered over many centuries of colonization. When colonizers do not leave, but stay and make their homes in the places they have usurped, they set themselves up as the superior race, and all others must bow down. The church has failed to be a unified, resounding voice in these matters. The church has abdicated their position of leading the world to the light. Even when Black attendees left to start their own churches because they were tired of the discrimination of so-called Christians, hearts remained unchanged. Now, in the light of the death of Mr. Floyd, the video that has been circulating, I am pleased, if that is a word I can use at this time. I'm hopeful because many of my fellow clergy who are not Black have reached out after witnessing this murder to express their deep regret at not being attentive to these matters in the past. And because of them and what I'm hearing from church leadership all over the world, I am hopeful that we are changing. I am hopeful that we are seeing the re-emergence of bold preaching and teaching about social justice and equity in the religious academy and in the sanctuaries all over the world. This is not just the responsibility of predominantly Black churches. We have always been the Protestant church. This is a call to all churches. And I am hopeful that leaders in all religious sects are standing up and proclaiming the truth that the subjugation and dehumanization of any person is not only legally and judicially wrong, but morally, ethically, socially, and philosophically wrong, just wrong. And the last point that I want our audience to understand is that this has been a very painful episode in the lives of Black people. I especially want to share as a Black mother, it has been difficult to hear messages from the birth of your Black male child that his life is in danger. I remember a heart-pounding reaction to statistics that John Singleton included in his seminal work, Boys in the Hood, back in 1991, that basically said if your American Black male child lived to be 18 years old, he was a statistical outlier. Can you imagine not being expected to live past 18? Now, to be clear, John Singleton was talking not just about police brutality, but street violence. And here's my point. If you manage to protect your child from street violence, if you manage to keep that child safe from gangs and criminal activity, if you are still not out of the woods, after you've managed to do those things, you are still not out of the woods because you also have to keep them safe from the police. Keeping our children safe from law enforcement is not new. Again, from the enslavement of Africans to Jim Crow to the civil rights movement to now the new Jim Crow, law enforcement has led the way when it comes to the terrorizing and lynching of Black people. It was a public spectacle and still is. Watch the George Floyd tape again. See the officer staring in the face of the camera. See the callousness, see the cold-bloodedness, see that he does not care. This is a public spectacle. It was a lynching. The killing of Tamir Rice was a lynching. The choking of Eric Garner was a lynching. The shooting of Michael Brown and leaving his body laying in the street for hours was a lynching. The hunting down and killing of Trayvon Martin and Ahmad Augury was vigilantism, but lynching just the same. And do not forget about the women. Imagine Brianna Taylor in her own home, minding her own business when police burst in and killed her. Sandra Bland ended up arrested on a routine traffic stop because she dared speak up. And then she mysteriously died in her jail cell that night. And now, Regis Korchinski-Paquette alive 1 minute and off her balcony the next. The officers in most of these cases have not been charged. As a Black person watching these murders, we are traumatized and re-traumatized. When does it end? When is it enough? When are we allowed to move about in the world freely and safely? When is justice served? I want our non-Black listeners to know that we need allies in this struggle. It is not acceptable for you not to say anything when you observe wrong behavior. It is not acceptable for law enforcement to brutalize us. It is not acceptable for us to have to live in fear. I leave you with this thought. It is easy here in Canada to look to the South and say we are not like that. But hear the voices of those who live in Black and brown skin. Yes, Canada too has a racial discrimination problem. Canada, too, is a victim of anti-Black racism in the hearts of its people. Canada, too, is carrying out public lynchings. This anti-Black racism can only be eradicated when it is acknowledged. Hear our voices. Hear our hearts. Let us do and be better together. Thank you.
Reverend Dr. Britton, I think if we were in one room, you'd hear a loud amen. Thank you for that moving presentation. I'd like to now introduce our third speaker, Tiffany Gordon. Tiffany, please go ahead and do your presentation. Thanks.
Hi, everyone. My name is Tiffany Gordon. As already mentioned, I'm a PhD student in the department here in philosophy, and I have a brief slideshow to share with you all. So Riel will be doing the sharing for me, and I'm hoping that all of my formats show up well and everyone can see the presentation. So I'm going to go very quickly because we don't have a lot of time. So the next slide. Okay, so in the overview, I see the fonts are a bit off, but I apologize for that. I will be talking about a brief history of Black Lives Matter, this notion of speaking truth to power, the epistemological implication of anti-Black racism, and some action steps on moving forward. Okay, so brief history of the movement. So we've talked about some of the instances that have happened in the news, but I thought that it would be good to kind of go back to the beginnings of Black Lives Matter to give us a reminder of where we came from and where we are today. So just as a reminder, this is a her story. In 2013, 3 radical Black organizers, Alicia Garza, Patrice Cullors, and Opal Tometi, created a Black-centered political will and movement building project called Black Lives Matter. It was in response to the acquittal of Trayvon Martin's murderer, George Zimmerman. So this is taken from the Black Lives Matter website. And this is just a little bit of a timeline of events. So the fonts are a little bit off, but I just wanted to remind us kind of where the movement started in 2013. This is when we first saw the hashtag Black Lives Matter come up on social media, and organizing started to happen around the hashtag. In 2014, we saw Black Lives Matter start to organize nationally and internationally, and Black Lives Matter Global Network was founded. It's 30 communities and growing across the world. In 2016, which I do think is a watershed moment in the movement, we saw NFL player Colin Kaepernick take a knee, and he has since been blackballed by the NFL and still hasn't been able to play in a game. But he and other athletes engaged in some really important activism around Black Lives Matter that we need to kind of keep in mind as we go forward. And I think here we are today. Obviously, I'm kind of speeding through history, but we're in early 2020, COVID hits the world. The pandemic happens, people are at home, and we start to see some parallels, I think, coming up in the news. And Teresa mentioned that between COVID-19, the pandemic that we're all suffering through and struggling with, and the pandemic of anti-Black racism, and the effect that both kinds of pandemics have on our well-being and in our lives. And I think COVID-19 is really important because I see a sense of empathy arising out of this moment that I haven't seen before in response to Black Lives Matter, and I think that's really important to keep in mind. I believe that a lot of people are feeling their humanity right now and feeling how vulnerable they are to outside forces. And this is the way that a lot of people in the Black community have felt for years. And then of course, May 25th, 2020, George Floyd is killed, as we've heard from different panelists. Protests begin, and the protests, it's good to keep in mind, and I'm happy that the other panelists have continued to say their names, that the protest is in response to the unjust murder of George Floyd, but also in response to other killings and murders that have happened. Just very recently, we heard Ahmad Augury, Brianna Taylor in Toronto, Regis Paquette. So we're mobilizing for more than one individual, although that one individual is a crucial reason for why we see people marching on the streets. Okay, and I thought it would be interesting too. I know everyone has been following the news, but in particular, these shifting perspectives on taking a knee, right? And looking at these shifting perspectives, I think, is really important for discussing the shift in consciousness that I see happening around Black Lives Matter, and a lot of people being more comfortable using that term where 5-6 years ago they wouldn't have been. So in 2017, we see an article from CNN saying there is no constitutional right to take a knee while you're at work. And then in 2020, we see an article from CNN, police officers are joining protesters for prayers and hugs in several US cities. And in this image, we see police officers taking a knee while at work, right? So I like to kind of highlight the consciousness shift that I think is happening that's very crucial for this moment. Okay, so Speak Truth to Power, that's the name of the panel discussion. And because I like to do research, I thought, well, why don't we kind of go through the origin of the term and see if we can draw some interesting things from history to inform our discussion today. So Speak Truth to Power was a pamphlet that was released by the American Friends Service Committee in 1955. They're a Quaker society, and it was in response to the Cold War. It was a pacifist document, and that's kind of where the term ended up coming into our collective consciousness, Speak Truth to Power. And an interesting historical note on this, we have Bayard Rustin, who was one of the people who put together the pamphlet. He was a civil rights organizer and activist. He was known to being an advisor to Martin Luther King Jr. He was a pacifist. He followed Quaker ideals and the teachings of Mahatma Gandhi. He was also openly gay and persecuted for being so. So I think there's an interesting historical connection between the talk that we're having today about speaking truth to power and the civil rights activist movement and the Black Lives Matter movements that we see on the ground. It's kind of interesting to tie all these things in historically. Okay, so I thought that it would be good to pull a couple quotes from the original text. So when they say speak truth to power in this pamphlet, this is what they say. Our truth is an ancient one, that love endures and overcomes, that hatred destroys, that what is obtained by love is retained, but what is obtained by hatred proves a burden. And when they speak about power in the text, this is a quote, to those who hold high places in our national life and bear the terrible responsibility of making decisions for war or peace. So those are the people in government, those are even the police organizations. To the American people who are the final reservoir of power in this country and whose values and expectations set the limit for those who exercise authority. And there's a third point at the bottom that I can't see on my screen, but I'll read it on a different screen. To the idea of power itself and its impact on 20th century life. So that's how the pamphlet conceives of power. So just to do a little bit of philosophy, the epistemological implications of anti-Black racism. I'm going to go through this part very quickly, but I'd be happy to expand upon anything during the Q&A session. So as you all know, I'm a philosopher. I do love philosophy. And one of my favorite areas of philosophy is epistemology. So epistemology is the study of knowledge and truth. And in this field of philosophy, these are the kinds of questions that people ask, right? So what can we know about the world? Are our beliefs about the world or anything at all justified? Can we know things about the world independently of experience, for example, mathematics? And another question that I think is really key for this discussion is what role does ignorance play in our ability to know? So one of the concepts that I think is really useful for thinking through this kind of collective shift is the notion of white ignorance. So we see this notion coming up in a book called Race and Epistemologies of Ignorance. It's a great read. And it's presented by Charles Mills, who is a philosopher who's still alive, something that I love to say because it's good when philosophers are not yet deceased. Many of them are. But a quote from the book, he talks about an ignorance that resists, that fights back, that is militant, aggressive, not to be intimidated, that is active, dynamic, that refuses to go quietly. And when we usually think of ignorance, we might think of a kind of passive blind spot that people have. But what Mills does in this article is that he argues, no, in fact, white ignorance is something that can actually kill, that's very militant. And sometimes it's a willful ignorance that is the most problematic part of this ignorance. And the concept of white ignorance is this idea that you can walk through a world structured by white supremacy and not realize your privilege within that system and not realize that other people are set on a hierarchy lower and beneath you. So the ability to do that, that privilege and that white ignorance, that's what Mills discusses in this piece. Another concept that I thought was really useful for thinking about these issues is the concept of epistemic injustice. So this comes up in Miranda Fricker's work. The best way to describe it is not being seen as credible. So we saw this in the Me Too movement and why it was so powerful, because women were for the first time believed in a lot of cases about facing sexualized violence at the hands of other people, where in other cases they weren't believed. They weren't seen as credible testimonies to their own experiences. And I'm gonna wrap this up in the next slide on how it kind of comes together. So this is an article by Sherry Lynn Johnson. She's a prof at Cornell Law School, and she talks about the fact that during a certain point in history, and I'm sure a lot of you know this, slaves couldn't actually testify against whites. So we see this idea of epistemic injustice coming up when it relates to Black people in North America who have been subjected to slavery and the descendants of them, that they weren't actually able to go into court, and if there was a harm perpetrated against them, their testimonies would not be seen as credible. Right? So that's how epistemic injustice is showing up in these cases. And just on the next slide, I'll give a modern day example of this. I think this was mentioned by the Reverend, but I know if you all were listening to the news when this first came out, there was a little bit of discussion about whether or not Mr. Floyd's death was actually as a result of asphyxiation. So there were some arguments going around that he had all these other conditions, that there were things in the system, and then maybe he didn't actually die because of what we thought he died from. He may have died from his own self-imposed death, which we know is ridiculous. And what's even more ridiculous about the notion is that there was video evidence of what happened. So we might ask ourselves, even today with video evidence, are Black people believed when we give our testimonies of being oppressed, of being racially discriminated against, of being almost killed? I mean, I would argue based on the evidence that epistemic injustice is something that a lot of Black folk are still dealing with. And we're dealing with a desire to be heard, to be listened to be understood, and for action to happen as a result of what you're hearing on the other end of our speaking. So this is, I think, a really interesting concept to think about in ongoing discussions. And I'm almost done. So next slide. So some action steps moving forward. I think this will go into the Q&A session. So I will end it here. Just talking about a little bit of my research. I'm interested in collective responsibility. And in philosophy, it's a little bit of a tricky notion because usually we think of us only being responsible for the things that we've done. So the arguments that come up, well, I'm not responsible for slavery. So why should I be made responsible for what happens nowadays? Actually, there are many ways in which we can be individually and collectively responsible for the things that are happening in our society and how we can take action to prevent these types of things from happening. So I'll discuss some of the examples in maybe the Q&A session, but next slide. So thank you for listening, and for more information, my email is there, and I'm sure you can find me online.
Thank you, Tiffany. I think your presentation demonstrates to us what we can do at Dalhousie and Institutes of Higher Learning to do the research and provide analytical and comprehensive arguments to the issues to help us understand what is happening around us too. And now I have to be very careful because when I put something out, I know there's a grad student who's going to research and present to me the history of what I say. So I'm going to give you two more: epistemic racism and epistemological hegemony.
Great. I'll put that on the list to research.
Okay. So now we go to Dr. Umishori Dryden. We are accustomed seeing you with the bullhorn out there on the streets, but Dr. Dryden, we are providing a different platform for you today. So please take over the microphone.
Thank you so much. Am I on? I am? All right, cool, thank you. So as the James R. Johnston Chair in Black Canadian Studies in the Faculty of Medicine, I stand in unwavering solidarity with all engaged in uprisings against police violence and brutality. We currently work and live in Chibukta, Halifax, the traditional unceded territory of the Maliseet, whose ancestors, along with the Mi'kmaq and Passamaquoddy nations, signed peace and friendship treaties with the British Crown in the 1700s. Yet we must not forget that these treaties were signed roughly 140 years before the end of slavery in this region, now called Canada. So I acknowledge the vibrant and longstanding African Nova Scotian communities. African Nova Scotian lives matter. In this acknowledgement, I honor Black and Indigenous people who continue to be here, those who continue to fight against genocide and the afterlives of slavery. I respectfully acknowledge our collective ancestors, Indigenous, Black, queer, trans, genderqueer, and two-spirit, who were born here, forced here, and continue to make home here. Black lives matter, Black women's lives matter, Black queer and trans lives matter. So in the short time I will focus briefly on three conditions: the politics of peaceful and respectable, the importance of defunding the police, and third, statements of solidarity and the contradictions embedded in equity, diversity, and inclusion. So first, politics of peaceful and respectable, One of the reasons that anti-Black racism, and I would add police brutality, persists in Canada is because of the faulty belief that Canada is a haven of racial tolerance. There is more of a commitment to that belief than there is in actually confronting the gross inequalities that Black people, including African Nova Scotians, and Indigenous communities continue to face. So I call names: Brianna Taylor, as others have said, she would have been 27 today, Regis Korchinski-Paquette, George Floyd, Tony McDade, an African-American trans man, Alicia Hudson, Jason Collins, Kevin Andrews, and yesterday, Chantel Moore, Indigenous people across the country from different communities, DeAndre Campbell, Andrew Loku, Jermaine Carby. These are just a few of the names of Black and Indigenous people who've been killed by police. Black people have been consistently subjected to inordinate violence, are considered disposable and easily killable. White supremacy has always held Black life cheap. Dr. Saidiya Hartman, in her 2006 seminal text, Lose Your Mother, Our Journey Along the Atlantic Slave Route, speaks to how the afterlife of slavery is characterized by the enduring presence of slavery's racialized violence, so obviously still present in contemporary society. The afterlife of slavery is witnessed through the skewed life chances, limited access to health and education, premature death, incarceration, and impoverishment. Public health practices are also implicated in these outcomes of the afterlife of slavery. In other words, anti-Black racism from slavery until today continues to be an active social condition of health and wellness. We must understand and declare police brutality and anti-Black racism as public health crises. And while peaceful protest should be doable, there's a way in which calling for peaceful protests during these uprisings becomes a form of policing behaviors, a type of respectability politics. So if we understand respectability politics as a form of moralistic discourse that seeks to pair personal social values with those of white supremacy and Eurocentrism, we need to reconsider the simplistic ways that we think about morality as being universal and objective. So what is meant by peaceful or respectable or order in comparison to chaos and violence and looters or rioters? Also, how are we to understand these logics of innocence, right? These claims of just doing the job, or they look scary. Blackness and Black people are constantly under surveillance, a surveillance whose purpose is to create, cause, and sustain fear. That deep-seated fear of seeing that police car pull out behind you, or racial profiling in the grocery store, pharmacy, hospital, schoolyard, school board, airport security, that Black youth playing basketball by themselves during COVID. Ultimately, the fear of being unsafe, perpetually in danger, this fear for ourselves and for one another. So how do we overcome our fears in the pursuit of something different? Well, it's not easy to do, since defiance is also scary, yet it is necessary. So how do we define order and chaos, as I said before, is predicated upon the determinations of white supremacy. This system of policing does not allow for good policing. Policing remains steeped in its origins, that of clearing Indigenous peoples off land, genocide of Indigenous people, protecting property, including sustaining the enslavement of people of African descent. This includes taking free Black people and returning them to slavery, or those fleeing being returned into slavery, or free Black people and trafficking them into slavery. We do ourselves a disservice in refusing to acknowledge the continued harm the systems of policing continue to perpetuate against our very beings, against our lives. So it's important to defund police. The energy that goes into excusing individual police and the system of policing for the harm and violence they continue to inflict on us remains striking. Police have been trained, continue to be trained. Lots and lots of money and time and energy has gone into training police, diversifying the police force, and yet Black and Indigenous people continue to be harmed and killed by police. Black people in Halifax are 6 times more likely than white people to be street checked. Black people in Toronto are 20 times more likely to be harmed and killed by police than white people. And the statistics of Indigenous death at the hands of police is staggering. And yet we circle back around the same solutions, more training. Defund and disarm the police is not simply a great hashtag. It's about actively working to dismantle and abolish the systems of dominance that continue to cause us harm and death. It is a call for a complete restructuring of society as we know it. And as I said, this is scary for some of us. And for others, while scary, the possibilities of something different are also exciting. So if we take the money from the police, we can put it into actually having a living wage for everyone. Or we take the money from the police tanks and military gear, and we put it into making sure there's clean drinking water and housing. Or we take money out of the police budget and we put it into community care teams, teams that can respond to wellness checks. We take the money from weaponry and we put it into properly funded, staffed, and regulated elder care homes. Or we take the money and we put it into drug support programs and safe injection sites and creating subsidized jobs for those formerly incarcerated. So I'm running out of time, so I want to talk a bit about statements of solidarity and the contradictions embedded in equity, diversity, and inclusion. Canada's enduring national narrative of multiculturalism makes it difficult for anti-Blackness to even be understood as endemic to and within the fabric of the nation. In the article, Resisting Inclusion, Decolonial Relations Between Peoples of African Descent and Original Peoples, Mutombo states, and I quote, "History shows how the white supremacist colonial state of Canada strategically desires our inclusion at times to further its colonial agenda, only to exclude us to sustain its racist anti-Black agenda. To be included in the nation state is to be in a colonial relationship with the land and with people, Indigenous people, and inclusion necessarily comes at the expense of Indigenous sovereignty and self-determination," end quote. So in this way, there's a recognition that inclusion as it is normatively operationalized cannot be freedom, and sameness cannot be social justice. Inclusion continues to be promoted as an antidote to many of the oppressions that hinder our material well-being. It's a corrective philosophy that finds its support in the basic belief that oppression happens exclusively through means of exclusion. And I venture that there is an overlap between the desires to claim "I don't see color" alongside Canadian claims of "all are welcome here." People get quite angry when disrupting the belief in a colorblind Canadian society or the belief that one does not see color. And we've seen those angry responses during COVID-19 and in response to the call for disaggregated race-based data. Yet, as I've said elsewhere, to operate in the belief that one can be colorblind or not see color only serves to perpetuate white supremacy and the logics of whiteness. Through this way, the use of diversity becomes a strategy that serves to manage normativity, harmony, civility, collegiality, and professionalism, but ultimately does not facilitate the disruption of systems of oppression. Meaning that the baseline of diversity work results in maintaining the status quo, the baseline, producing a culture of silence and in effect attempting to gesture to more diversity than it actually exists. So it's understandable that many people have had visceral responses to the many solidarity statements produced by organizations, corporations, and institutions. What does it mean that the NFL sent out a statement saying Black Lives Matter, while at the same time saying Colin Kaepernick can't play, just as an example? Those who have been harmed by institutions unable to complete their degree, getting fired for not tolerating racism or racist sexual harassment or racist homophobic violence, those dropping out of school, those told they are not a good fit where the institutions not a good fit by organizations, corporations attempting to steal our breath. What are they to make of these statements? Importantly, how will the organizations, corporations, and institutions who have released these statements of solidarity make restitution to those who have been harmed and ensure those still here are no longer harmed? And there's no easy answer to this. And I have my own ideas. Is it possible to apply forms of harm reduction? The implementation of policies, programs, and practices that aim to minimize the negative impacts of anti-Black racism and colonialism on all Black people. To draw on the literature of harm reduction, it's understood to be grounded in justice and human rights, focusing on positive change and with working with people without coercion and discrimination. Therefore, harm reduction is not focused on minimizing the behavior of Black people. It's focused on minimizing and disrupting the systems of anti-Black racism in which our very own university has been structured and created. And here I refer you to the Lord Dow report. This means it's not about false notions of meritocracy and simply including more Black bodies. After all, colonialism and anti-Black racism create the structures that allow there to be a single Black person in a department, in a classroom, in an incoming class. As professors and scholars, it is incumbent upon us to understand these complicated and interconnected realities of anti-Black racism from slavery to today and this continuing colonialism. Revolution is a process and not a one-time event. I'll end there. Thank you.
Dr. Dryden, thank you so much. During the whole presentation, I was just nodding my head. I probably have whiplash by now, but we will be talking more since we are on the same campus. Thank you so much. Appreciate it. We have our final speaker, Dr. Isaac Zany. Dr. Zany, would you please take the talking stick?
First, I'd like to say it's an honor to be on this panel. It's also very painful because the occasion is the unceasing, unending violence against people of African descent and other oppressed and exploited peoples. What I want to chat about first and talk about is specifically that this violence and the George Floyd deaths and other violence against people of African descent that have been highlighted recently because of social media are taking place within the context of the COVID-19 pandemic. They are both very connected. The COVID-19 pandemic laid bare the bankruptcy, venality, inhuman nature, and the lethal character of the socioeconomic and political system that we live in. Some may call that racial capitalism. We know that African Americans have died at disproportionately high rates. I myself am talking and working with doctors in Louisiana and in other communities, and where it is becoming incredibly distressing. What COVID-19 has done, okay, and what is clearly demonstrated by what has happened to George Floyd, is that it has illustrated dramatically the integral connection of race and class, white supremacy, and the political and social arrangements that exist, as well as imperialism. And anti-Black racism is an important constituent element of this whole poisonous concoction, as Gerald Horne would say. It is not just simply a denial of the rights of people of African descent, but as Gerald Horne points out, and I encourage people to read his new book, The Dawning of the Apocalypse, The Origins of Slavery, White Supremacy, Settler Colonialism, and Capitalism in the Long 16th Century. It is a denial of the right to have rights. That is, it's a denial of the humanity of people of African descent. This whole pandemic and what has emerged with the rebellion has demonstrated that the system is unable to meet the needs of humanity. We have seen the gutting through endless years of austerity of the social spheres, the public healthcare system, and we have seen the explosion of unemployment, hunger, and growing insecurity for the vast majority of the people. Simultaneously, we have seen trillions of dollars that have been siphoned off into the coffers of the financial oligarchy. Okay? One of the greatest transfers of wealth, we can say expropriation of wealth upward in the history of the world. I.e. from the poor, the oppressed, the disenfranchised, to the super rich. The COVID-19 destabilization of the present system is perhaps akin historically to the 14th century plagues that ran through Europe. The plague in the 14th century destabilized feudalism, setting the stage for the elimination of feudalism and the rise of capitalism, we see a similar destabilization is taking place. And the rebellions that have emerged, and I think the rebellions have assumed a particular character because of the shredding of society and the revealing of the hypocrisy and the lie that lies at the heart of the existing economic system, perhaps are unprecedented, and perhaps one can only think back to 1968. We often think of the 60s as this age of upheaval and revolutionary activity, but 1968 becomes this iconic year. And in 1968, it's all obviously April of 1968, when in the wake of the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr., 140 cities went up in rebellion, okay? As some people have pointed out already in the talk, and I think Tiffany mentioned this, one of the interesting phenomena, which we can go into the question and answer, is that what we are also witnessing is the multi-racial, multi-ethnic, and multinational nature of these protests, of these uprisings, of these rebellions. And this poses a particular problem to a state founded on white supremacy. So I think that provides the sort of broad context in what we're witnessing in terms of this national rebellion. I think it's also important, and this is sort of drawing on what Reverend Dr. Britton has said and what Dr. Dryden has said, is that when we look at this from the perspective of Canada, we see a lot of comparing going on between Canada and the United States. And Canadians often like to talk about US exceptionalism, the way the United States portrays itself as a shining hill, shining city on the hill, as this beacon of democracy and human rights. And obviously the reality demonstrates that to be a falsehood. Canada also has its Canadian exceptionalism. And as Dr. Dryden has pointed out, Canada frequently likes to portray itself as this multicultural mosaic, this harmonious multicultural mosaic that is unlike the United States, a sort of anti-US space, a sort of antithesis to what exists in the United States. Much is made of in Canada of the fact that Canada was sort of like the northern end of the Underground Railroad. People escaping slavery in the US South before the US Civil War, making it to northern states, but only really coming across to Canada because under the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, you could be pursued. Escaped Africans could be pursued into northern US states and captured and therefore re-enslaved. People escaped into Canada. And in the 1840s to 1850s, around 30 to 40,000 escaped Africans created communities in southern Ontario, eventually returning, most of them returning after the end of slavery, the abolition in 1895. So Canada is often presented as that. But people fail to realize, and as laid out in the Lord Dalhousie report, that Canada was a slave society until the 1830s. And Canada is built on the dispossession and the attempt to first physically and then culturally eliminate indigenous peoples. And then a counterpoint to that was also the existence of slavery in Canada, which perhaps we can go into much greater detail in the question and answer period. But that existence of slavery in Canada established a constellation of worldviews, of practices that would shape the trajectory of communities of people of African descent in Canada, in this province, particularly the long-standing African Nova Scotian community. This has very significant consequences. We have had, for example, when Canada was formally created in July 1st, 1867, under what's called the British North American Act, we have not only a constitution that denies that there are other peoples who are part of what becomes this new state, focuses only on the French and the English-speaking peoples, so for European peoples, it ignores the indigenous people, it ignores people of African descent, but also Canada then creates an immigration policy of keeping Canada white, articulated by then Minister of Labor, who then becomes Prime Minister of Canada, Mackenzie King. He articulated this, that Canada is a white man's country and it is desirable that Canada remain that way. And we have racist immigration policies up until the 60s, explicitly racist policies up until the 1960s. Within that, we've had the marginalization and disenfranchisement of people of African descent, such that in the latest census data, 2001, 2006, 2016, and then the 2011 National Housing Survey Act, we see starkly delineated before us the tremendous racial inequalities that exist. And Dr. Dryden has mentioned some of this. But for example, while, for example, we have 21% of the Black population, 25 to 29, lives in low income poverty situations, as opposed to 12% for the rest of Canada. And when you look at children, it's 27% according to the census data, okay, as compared to 14% for the broader Canadian society. Dr. Dryden also pointed out when it comes to policing, the criminal justice system, we have incredibly disproportionate impact on people of African descent. In Halifax, as has been mentioned, if you're a person of African descent, you're more than 6 times likely to be arbitrarily stopped by the police. In Toronto, you're more than 20 times likely to be a fatality of police shooting than the rest of society. We also know that in terms of impoverished rates in Nova Scotia, if you're a child, you're more than twice as likely to live in an impoverished low-income family than in the rest of the population. So this history that I briefly outlined and others have mentioned have real-world consequences in the here and now. And it is for this that I think that when we look at the existing political and economic social arrangements, we are calling out for what is required is very significant change. In terms of the university and in an institutional environment, there's certain things they can do. We're talking about finally to have a Black and African diaspora studies major at Dalhousie University, which would conscientize people about what is unfolding and the undergirding history and conditions that have created these problems. These things do not fall from the sky. There's a long historical trajectory that has led to them. There is hope. And there are some positive things that perhaps can cause, that can galvanize us to think that a possible better world can perhaps emerge from this. And I think it's from the scope of these rebellions that we've seen, and not only in the United States, but the sympathetic and supportive protests that have taken place here, not only to support the rebellions in the United States, but also specifically to pinpoint the kind of anti-Black violence and anti-Indigenous violence that exists within Canada itself. So given the fact that we have the scope of these national rebellions, given the fact that, as Tiffany pointed out, there has been a shift in people's consciousness to the point where now people can talk about Black Lives Matter, people can talk about things they would not consider to have been things they would, that they would have considered to have been true, and therefore to have been valid. They now accept these things as valid. That certain people in what Glenn Ford refers to as the Black misleadership class, the super rich, themselves now have abandoned some of their conservative views and have now begun to openly attack and talk about racial inequality. It's one of the contradictions when one thinks of the anti-Black racism that has unfolded recently, is that while the world was transfixed, or a large section of the world was transfixed to the documentary playing out on Netflix and ESPN on Michael Jordan, this African-American athlete, we have this ongoing violence against people of African descent. Such that even Michael Jordan himself just announced that he is going to donate $100 million to racial justice causes and so on. So I think there's some positive things that are developing. The question is, this is a historic time, whether it is a pivotal turning point, subsequent events and developments will pass the judgment on that. But at this moment, there is at least a transformation, however temporary, in people's consciousness that can perhaps lead to a movement that can lead to the deep structural transformations that Dr. Dryden referred to. Rocky Jones, the civil rights activist and esteemed African Nova Scotian, the late Dr. Burnley Rocky Jones, said that freedom is a constant struggle, and the struggle continues. Thank you.
Thank you, panelists. I've gotten permission to go a little over time, so we do have some time for Q&A. And I want to remind our participants that please, if you have a question, post it in the Q&A section at the bottom of your screen. We are looking at the questions as they come in, and I'm trying to group them. And FYI, we are close to 400 participants. So thank you, participants, for sharing in our forum today. I'm going to read 2 sets of questions, group them together, mainly the focus of the question. One has to do with what to do with the institutional responses and statements about anti-Black racism. And the other question speaks to what can non-Black and allies do to support the struggle. I think, Tiffany, you had mentioned collective responsibility and so on. And the institutional one, I think, sorry, you and Derek touched on it a little bit. And then I think, so I'll let you all respond to that one, and then we'll move to the second one, which maybe Reverend Dr. Rhonda Britton and Tiffany could touch on with what that has to do with our non-Black allies. Just turn on your microphone when you're ready. Don't make me be a professor and call you out as a student.
So I guess I'll go first because I kind of left my presentation a bit hanging in response to the question. So I'm not sure if Rigel can pull up my final slide on collective responsibility. I'm more of a visual person, so it helps me to track what I'm saying. One of the things that I feel a lot of people are sensing at this point is a need to not have the momentum die, and a need to have people take on the activism beyond marching in the streets, which is crucial and important to their daily lives, right? So how do we take the responsibility for anti-Black racism and to not perpetuate it amongst ourselves into our individual lives? And I think we could think about it in two different ways. So we have the individual responsibility, non-Black people, white people, and think about it in terms of the individual interactions you have with individuals at work. Work has been a place for a lot of us that has been very uncomfortable. We've dealt with a lot of microaggressions and anti-Black racism. Your interactions with Black people in the grocery stores, in the streets. I don't know if everyone remembers a couple years ago when living while Black was a hashtag that we saw all around, because wherever it was that Black people went, it seemed the police were being called. So I think we can take responsibility in terms of our interactions with one another, but also in response to Dr. Dryden's note of the police and what the police can do in order to reduce the violence, we can think about how resources can be taken from the state and the police system and invested into communities of color, Black communities in particular, and also how corporate organizations and different levels of the government can implement policies that are for communities of color, but Black people in particular, that will actually affect change. So you're looking at your hiring practices. There are a bunch of things that we could probably brainstorm together for hours on end that will actually continue to move this forward. But I think the important part is not to just let it die when the movement dies, that take this into your individual lives and make it a responsibility for yourself to continue to act in ways that are ethical and moral.
And I'll just piggyback on that, since we were answering the same question or addressing the same question. I like, Tiffany, that you have this divided into personal and institutional responsibility. And this has been something that I've been talking to people about for a number of days now in terms of personal responsibility. It's no longer turning a blind eye to what we see happening to people. And I really appreciate some of the video going around of people who are putting themselves in the protests, putting themselves between police and Black people, non-Black people putting themselves between police and Black people, that they see police approaching a person who is Black and being aggressive with them or doing something, and they throw themselves in the middle. I'm not saying to people here in Halifax that you have to throw yourself in the middle, but maybe you do. I mean, it depends on what's happening. But what you need to be able to do is to speak up when something is wrong. We cannot shy away from these things. And I think when you talk about our interactions, our interactions at work and in public places and such, I think that it's incumbent upon all of us to be civil to people and to be less suspicious of people. Let's start losing some of these suspicions. I think the more you interact with people, the less suspicious you are. And so I encourage that. One of the things that I've encouraged when I think about institutional responsibility, I throw the church in with that, is that for the preachers and teachers in churches, that you need to address this issue. You can't shy away from it. You can't sweep it under the rug. You can't pretend it doesn't exist because it's not in your individual church. I think you have to speak on it to let your congregation know where you stand as the leader in that congregation, but also to teach people the impact, the implications, all of the consequences, the trauma that's visited upon people in Black and brown skin because of things that you do. One of the things that people get very offended about in my experience is, you know, this whole idea of white privilege. And if you mention white privilege, people are immediately offended to say, I'm not racist, I'm not privileged. And they don't understand what the term means, in the sense that just by virtue of you not being in Black skin, by virtue of you not being in brown and Black skin, there are certain perceptions and certain opportunities that are open to you. You don't have to worry about being followed in the store just because you're Black. You don't have to worry about people approaching you in an aggressive manner just because you're Black. And this is something that we live with every day. And so when we talk about white privilege, it's not something that you do, is that you have the privilege of participating in the society in ways that we do not, because you are not Black. And so just as you can't help the color that you were born in, we can't help the color we were born in. But being aware of the fact that there are certain things that you have at your disposal that we do not have by virtue of your skin color, you can say, I choose to open the door to be, I choose to be aware of that. I choose to educate myself about that, to see it happening, and to realize that I'm being approached in a different way just because I'm not Black. And so I think personal responsibility includes this, always this self-reflection, self-education, being mindful of your situation and the environment around you, and taking those interactions that you see happening, filtering them through this lens to say, is that person being treated differently? Is there some disparate treatment going on here because that person is Black? And then, of course, like I said, in the institutions, I agree, if you are policymakers, if you're sitting around those kinds of tables, if you are hiring managers, if you have a position that gives you some power over other people and what their fates are in this life in terms of whether or not they get to have certain positions or move in certain ways inside of institutions, then you need to be well aware of what your inherent biases are and what you are feeling and thinking about people because you see a name on a page that doesn't look like a name, you know, that doesn't look like Michael or something that you think is more generic and vanilla. And so you need to be aware of those things. You need to be aware of the way that you approach people and the ways that you make for people or block people. And if you can be objective in saying, I take this person and I don't know anything in terms of their skin color, and I may not even know their names, just person A and person B, and I look at what their qualifications are, and I look at what their experience is, you know, can I choose on that basis and put all of this other stuff away? It's not a sense of not seeing color or ignoring the fact that people are Black, but in training yourself to say, I'm not going to be biased because they're Black. And so, yeah, I just want to add that. And I always encourage people, don't tell me that you don't see color, because I want you to see that I'm a beautiful Black woman, you know, from Florida, who's living in Nova Scotia, who's made some choices to be in this life, and this is what I do, and this is who I am, and all of that's a part of me. So don't discount who I am, thinking you're doing me a favor. Okay.
Yeah. I want to switch. I'm reading all the questions, and as soon as I open the door, we have a flood of questions. The theme that is coming out from a lot of those questions is about how do institutions address these things. And the questions focus around educational institutions as well as society, where we do have policies. What do we do in these cases? And I'll be listening very keenly based on my current position. So I don't know if Dr. Brooms and Dr. Dryden, do you want to try and address those things?
Yes, I'll jump in really quickly. And I think some of what I'm going to say is going to connect with what we just heard from Dr. Brighton and Dr. Gordon. I'm calling you Dr. Gordon. I'm just, we putting that in there. So you are becoming.
Well, thanks. I think some of my committee members and professors are listening, so it's a joke. I'm not there yet, but I will be soon. Thanks.
Right. So I think there's a couple of things, and so, you know, right where Dr. Brighton left off, she made a point, and one of the ways that I think about it is like color consciousness. And so we have this dance that we do where, from an ideological standpoint, and really from a rhetorical standpoint, we profess color blindness, right? Because in many ways, what that suggests is we're going to treat everybody equally. But the reality is, when we think about what Amy Cooper did in Central Park, when we think about the ways in which Black folks continue to face, as Dr. William Smith talks about, these racial battles, right? And they develop this racial battle fatigue. What we begin to realize is that even though we have these claims for color blindness, most folks are operating through socialization and learning through a lens of color consciousness, right? You don't fear Black men in public because you don't see them as Black. You fear them precisely because you identify them as Black and male, and then tie them to a very particular narrative that says that they are either criminals or threats. And so then the response is as Dr. Gordon talked about, like, living while Black. We're gonna call police on folks because you have offended the white space, right? This is a white space. You don't belong. So, so I wanted to just mention that. I think there's a couple of things that I think about in terms of institutional responses. And so the first one that I'm kind of a bit ticked off about is this very easy, low-level, simplistic statements that condemn the killing of George Floyd and other folks, right? So it is akin to people who get up on the third Monday of January and very selectively and benignly identify one quote from Dr. Martin Luther King and act as if we're walking out his legacy, right? Because in the same speech that they want to say, judge us by the content of our character, not the color of our skin, they also ignore the parts of his speech that say America's giving us a blank check, right? They also ignore, all these calls that he talks about with these racial injustices. And so as I think about institutional statements as well as kind of institutional efforts, again, what we need is some assessments. So don't talk to me about what your commitment is. If we look at your assessments and what you've done in the past up to this point, don't align with the rhetoric that you're trying to offer us. So don't tell me you're committed to inclusive excellence, as an example, because this is now, every 10, 15 years, we get new buzzwords in higher education about what we're subscribing to. So it used to be diversity, and then that got watered down and co-opted. Then it became inclusion, and that got watered down and then co-opted. And now we're at inclusive excellence, and I'm still trying to figure out what that's. If you're inclusive, like, is there a bad inclusive? Okay, anyway, so part of what I'm thinking here is, like, number one, some institutions really need to do some very real self-assessments. And primarily this means, and I saw in some of the questions, we're not talking about intentions, we're talking about actions. So what are the actionable items that we're doing that it's gonna move the needle based on kind of where we're at in the current time period to where it is we're trying to go? And then even asking questions of why are we trying to get to that particular point? And what will this mean for our institution? Because part of the challenge that we face is that we have folks who are working against, or we have folks who are supporting the status quo and working against progress. And by folks, I'm talking about people who are students at the institutions, people who are faculty and staff at the institutions, as well as alumni. And so some of the change that we're trying to create in institutions are running up against walls where folks want the institution to be the same institution that it was when they attended 5 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago. And so if our institutions, if our administrators at our institutions are not committed to change, it has to happen at the top down. We need the top down and the bottom up. I don't think we need an either or, right? So we need students demanding it, but they should not be burdened with the work of doing it. So students should not be educators for other students and faculty and staff. We're gonna learn from students' experience. Listen, we don't need more Black folks to die for us to learn that we live in racist societies and anti-Black societies. So even the narratives that we use with regards to what we need in order for us to learn, well, it becomes burdens, right? So there's the burden of proof that I belong, but also the burden of my life is worthy, my intellect is worthy, my aspirations are worthy, that becomes problematic. So anyway, let me say two other quick things. Number one is that we've got to assess what we're doing and then put strategies and mechanisms in place that calls for an all hands on deck. So this can't simply be something out of the admissions office. It can't simply be something out of the president's or provost's office. This has to be filtered across faculty and staff, and then use that to support students as they learn and become more saturated with regards to these kind of changes that we're trying to impact. And then second, we got to have ongoing assessment of it. So what does that look like 1 year out? What does that look like 3 years out? What does that look like 5 years out? And in those assessments, if we're not making the progress that we thought we're trying to make, then we have to ask those hard questions. Why haven't we gotten to a particular point? And some of that is because we have folks who are working within these institutions who still have ideologies that support, or that are, vested and invested in kind of this white-centric ideologies. So I'll end there because I know other folks may have some things to say.
And before, Zany, kick in, I just want to remind the audience that we have extended the time, so please stay on. We are here. Okay, so with that, does Dr. Dryden or Dr. Zany wants to jump in?
Sure, I'll step in for a minute. Thank you. I think we've been talking about how to decolonize the university for over 20, 30, 40 years. I think there's been a lot of really amazing documentation and reports and institutes that has explored how to decolonize the university. But I think if we're looking about true decolonization or anti-colonization, then the universities as they're currently structured can't actually become those things. We need to think differently about building different types of universities, if that's actually what we think through. But if we want to continue thinking about putting these structures in as a form of harm reduction, then we've also been talking about this for some time. So just off the top of my head, in universities, I think we need to rethink the ways in which student evaluations or teaching evaluations are often weaponized against Black professors, Black teaching assistants, Indigenous professors, Indigenous teaching assistants, Black and queer folks. Yet teaching evaluations are often used as a measure of whether or not you are a good fit in the classroom. And how is one a good fit in the classroom, especially if they're talking about white supremacy and Eurocentrism, and the professor at the front of the class is one of two Black people or people of color in the classroom, and this is the conversation they're having. People get really frustrated and upset. I'm sure we can see this in many different questions, this kind of proof, again, this proof. How do you know there's systemic racism? Why do you keep playing the race card? Why is this a thing? Like, what do you mean I don't, what do you mean I see color? I don't see color. And we know if they're driving that they do see color because they stop at stoplights. But we also know that they see color when they start hurling racial epithets. And that's like the farthest out of the way thing that they do. One of the other ways that we see how so color blindness, as I said in my talk, is really just another way of instituting and implementing white supremacy. We're still at a stage where if there's hiring in the university, you have only white people shortlisted. Like, we're still at that stage. Yet the people who have made that selection will claim that those were the best people to shortlist, yet the best people that they shortlisted have research interests similar to the people on the committee. And one of the things, and that doesn't speak to diversity, that just speaks to a replication of what's already in the department or already happening in the system. When you only have one Black student in a classroom and you don't intervene or you turn to that Black student and you kind of ask them to speak on behalf of all Black people, these are the ways that we are perpetuating anti-Black racism and white supremacy. And I want us to think clearly about saying that these things are happening, not because I'm Black or we're Black, but because it's anti-Black racism. It's because of their white supremacy. I think it's important that people understand that that is the thing that's at play. right? I am not the one causing this kind of harm. I am the one having this harm perpetrated against me. And we do need to look at the statements. There was a lot of statements on Twitter. I spent a bit of time on Twitter, you might have noticed. A lot of statements on Twitter like, I pledge to peacefully oppose racist violence. How does one peacefully oppose racist violence? So what's being stated there is that by responding to racist violence vigorously, that somehow that is the wrong way to address racism. And we see this. Why don't you just sit at the table and talk to us? Why don't you just tell us about the things that we can do to change it? Similar to what Dr. Brooms just said. But we've had those conversations. We have that documentation. So we know how to increase representation in the university. We choose not to do it. And if we look at Dr. Melinda Smith's work, the way that diversity has been working out lately continues to benefit white people with disabilities, white women, white people, white LGBTQ folks. It is not benefiting Black and Indigenous people. So if there is a commitment, then what that means is you need to step out of the way. You need to step out of the way and actually allow for, try something new, something that does not make any sense to you, which means you are not the one that can be in charge of that process. That's what that means. And what we have seen, again, is this claim to, well, we want to make sure we're hiring, those with the best merit, that kind of thing. Merit is not an objective measure. Merit is a measurement used in white supremacy. And so I think if we fully understand the insidiousness of systemic racism, again, don't ask us to prove it. We already know that it exists. If it didn't exist, we wouldn't have that horrendous, those horrendous statistics about who's dying and who's being incarcerated. We wouldn't have that. So these are the ways, these are just some of the ways, again, that we can speak about, again, to what the university can and should be doing.
Doctor, sorry. We have just, we extended it to 7:45, so we have 3 minutes left. And so before I kind of close off, I will take 1 minute. There was a question directed to Dalhousie. And since I'm the Vice Provost for Equity and Inclusion, I should try to answer it, although Dr. Brooms and Dr. Dryden set me up, but that's okay. You are my friends and colleagues. So is there one last statement that anybody would like to say in this last 3 minutes? And to the audience out there, I'm sorry we didn't get to all your questions, but we have them noted. And if you wish to connect with us on a one-to-one, you can use our website to do that.
Perhaps I can say something. First, I'd say like on the institutional issue, and I thought Dr. Dryden or Dr. Brooms have made a reference, is that we've had enough statements and we've had enough studies. It's time to have concrete action and put resources behind initiatives. And I think that's a critical thing. I think when we look at what's unfolding, given, shall we say, the emperor has no clothes, the system has been revealed for what it is. I think one of the things is that the question of whether this historic moment becomes transformed into a turning point depends on we cannot do things in the old way. Okay? And it requires some very fundamental change that takes place. There has been, I would argue, as Tiffany has mentioned, a transformation of people's consciousness. How lasting this will be, will this momentum be continued, is something that, obviously unfolding events will let us know. But I think one of the fundamental things is to continue to organize. And it's in crisis moments, particularly for communities of people of African descent, that positive things, however temporary, however transitory, however not permanent those changes may be, it's in those crisis moments that we do get at least some substantive change.
Thank you, Dr. Zany. Am I muted or am I on? No, I'm not muted. Great. So I'd like to close off by thanking again the panelists. I know you all are extremely busy and you took the time to do this. And I can see from the chat that people are very appreciative of it and have a lot of positive things for it. There are some students out there because I got a request for references. So we'll be contacting you on that. But just in closing, to respond to where Dalhousie is currently, and Dr. Brooms asked that we need to do assessments of where we are and not just issue statements and so on. So based on the assessment of where Dalhousie is, I think I treat racism and sexism and all the isms like drug addictions. And we can do a lot of things, but unless we admit that we have a problem, we're not going to move forward. And Dalhousie has done that. I mean, the Lord Dalhousie report may have forced us to do that, but we have done that. We admitted we have a problem and we did apologize. In my assessment, Dalhousie has a lot of great policies and we are trying to enforce those policies. And we do have a lot of good programs and support services and so on. But as I said before, do we need to do more? Can we do more? Can we accelerate it? The answer is yes. For my assessment, where we are right now is what Dr. Brooms mentioned, and I wrote it down, actionable items. So we now have to take these great policies and so on, and the programs and projects and units that we have and build that on. We have to move to the how-to. We have to take the policies and try to decide how to enact them and how to be accountable for the enaction of these policies. So I can't do it by myself, so I'm going to call on everybody to get together and let's move it forward. I'm very hopeful. We have to be hopeful, especially in these times. We have to. I mean, we can't let the hundreds of thousands of people who have died, both in the Black community and the Indigenous community, we cannot let their lives be gone without a contribution. George Floyd's death created a world of awareness and action and so on. And so we need to do our part in the institution of higher learning. And I think we are along there, but we need for you and the community to keep pushing us. I am not afraid of critiques. I'm not afraid of recommendations. I'm not afraid of push, because that's what we need to move forward. So this is just one aspect of that commitment. And I want again to thank you all, to thank the audience, to thank my behind the scene crew, and let's keep on fighting, folks. According to Harriet Tubman, we can be sick and tired, but we are sick and tired of being sick and tired, but we cannot stop. And for the communities out there, we are still rising. So thank you and good night. You've been a wonderful panelist. You've been a wonderful crew, and we wish you all the best. And Tiffany, you and I will be talking too.
Okay, great. I look forward to it.
Thank you, everyone.
Okay, thanks. Bye, folks.
Yes.
Bye.
Thank you, everyone. Good night. Be well.
Right, thanks for coming.
Okay.
Struggle continues.
Black Lives Matter.